I'd like to welcome everyone today. If you're just coming in, please feel free to get lunch. And I think we have enough chairs, but if we don't, there are some more over here if there's extra seating needed. So I'm glad to see everyone today. This is our second Core Connections lecture for this year, and today we have Shanto Iyengar. He comes to us from Stanford University, where he holds appointments in the departments of political science and communications. His research interests include the role of mass media in democratic societies, especially as it affects political campaigns and shapes the psychology of voting. He's the author of several award-winning books. So here are some titles: Media Politics, A Citizen's Guide; Going Negative, How Political Advertisements Shrink and Polarize the Electorate; Explorations in Political Psychology; News That Matters, Television and American Opinion. He edits the journal Political Communication. He is the recipient of numerous grants and awards from places like the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, the Ford Foundation, the Pew Charitable Trusts, and from an obscure little enterprise called Google. And if you are yet to be convinced of the high stature of our speaker today, I can tell you that for at least 2 of your UNE professors, his work was assigned reading in their own graduate courses. So please join me in welcoming Professor Iyengar.
Well, thanks very much, Catherine. I was telling Eric as we were driving up from Portland that it was nice to be back in New England. I spent 8 years in New Haven, and so I'm well aware of the challenges of the New England winter. And one of the reasons I fled and relocated in sunny California, I went from Yale to UCLA, was that it just finally, since I grew up in a tropical country, I'm originally from South India, it just, after a while, I felt that it was just, I was aging prematurely. But anyway, it's great to be back. I'm also familiar enough with the politics of this area, and I'm looking forward to touring around and maybe getting a glimpse of former President Bush later on this afternoon. So what I want to talk about today is polarization, and so the title for this talk is, with apologies to Hunter Thompson, who, of course, as you probably know, wrote the classic book about the 1972 presidential campaign, which had George McGovern running against Richard Nixon. Hunter Thompson's book on that campaign was Fear and Loathing Across Party Lines. And so I've adopted that title for this talk. Now, by way of an overview, some of the things I'm going to be addressing in this talk concern I've got them in terms of questions. So are Americans increasingly finding themselves in environments that are sort of politically homogeneous, the so-called red and blue America? And the answer to that, I'm sorry to report, is yes. Do they typically encounter information and analysis from what we might characterize as red and blue news sources, i.e. Fox News or MSNBC? The answer is yes. And finally, and most of the time I'm going to be documenting this last point, is the result of this increasing intolerance and stereotyping of people that you disagree with. So in the case of Democrats, how do they feel about Republicans? And if we ask Republicans for their opinions about voters who support President Obama, we see increasing animosity, increasing hostility across the party divide. So there is an ongoing debate in political science about the extent to which America is a polarized society. So if you look at the question of elite polarization meaning at the level of elected officials, there is pretty much of a consensus that elites have indeed polarized. So if you look at the roll call votes in the U.S. Congress, there's very good data on the extent to which Democrats and Republicans vote together against each other. And today it's pretty much universal. And the ongoing, as we approach the fiscal cliff, if you've been reading the newspapers, you may have noticed that we seem to be approaching another instance of gridlock in which the two sides are unable to compromise and sort of find some sort of common ground. So there's no debate here that political elites are clearly polarized, and it's had some dysfunctional consequences, at least with respect to public policy. Where you do get some debate and controversy is at the question of has it spread to affect just ordinary Americans? Does it affect the mass public? And here there are at least there's two schools of thought. What I'm calling the maximalists, political scientists like Alan Abramowitz, who teaches at Emory University, who has been writing that the public is following elected officials and becoming more divided on the issues. So Democrats are taking more liberal positions on policies like abortion, taxing the rich, and Republicans are increasingly offering conservative positions on these policies. But my colleague Fiorina has written quite extensively and I think persuasively that by and large, if you look at how people feel about issues, policy issues, you still see a fairly standard sort of a bell-shaped curve, a normal distribution with more people in the middle who say that they're not really liberal or conservative, they're sort of in between. And so in that sense, Fiorina's point is that public polarization has yet to develop to the same extent as at the level of the elected officials. And Fiorina makes a point that if there is some evidence of polarization at the mass level, it's the result of what political scientists have termed sorting. So the sorting concept is that simply, if you think about party identification, are you a Democrat or a Republican? And then you ask a different question, ask the same respondent, are you a liberal or a conservative? And in the 1950s, if you took Democrat, Republican, and just had, forced people into those two categories and then overlaid that with liberal, conservative, you would find, not surprisingly, you would find a very weak association. There were quite a few liberal Republicans in the 1950s and quite a few conservative Democrats. So clearly the party of Lyndon Johnson, Southern Democrats in the 1960s were all quite conservative on most issues. So the sorting phenomenon refers to the fact that since 1960, the two parties, Democrat and Republican and liberal and conservative, have now sort of come into alignment. There are very few liberal Republicans and very few conservative Democrats. And so by that logic, you could say that you've not only got the push along party lines, but you've also got a consistent push along ideological lines, and that's pushing people apart on the issues. So to be a liberal Democrat is telling you, well, I'd better be an environmentalist. And to be a conservative Republican, that's more pressure than to have a conservative view on policy preferences. All of that is just basically a footnote to the extent that maybe there's increased ideological polarization because of this sorting phenomenon. However, I'm not going to be talking about polarization in terms of policy. The entire debate about polarization in American political science has focused on this question of ideology. Are people to the left or to the right on policy issues? I'm going to offer a different definition which is more in line with the notion of polarization as hatred, polarization as negative affect for people you disagree with, or more generally, animosity or antagonism. So I'm sort of, in a sense, arguing that the existing debate is somewhat off the mark, that we should be more concerned about affect rather than ideology. So going all the way back to the work of the sociologist Emrin Bogardus, who coined this notion of social distance, the idea that in-groups and out-groups like to distance themselves from each other. We are going to show you some data that in the modern era, Democrats and Republicans see each other very much as outgroups. And in fact, it's not just the idea that it's an outgroup, but indeed the theory of group dynamics, and as it evolved into the psychological theory of social identity, leads you to predict that the mere fact that you identify with a group is sufficient to generate a sense of positive bias towards fellow group members, i.e. you feel close to the in-group and you feel distant from the out-group. And if you translate that into affect, it's you have a positive set of feelings for those you identify with. So if you're a Democrat, you feel good about other Democrats, and you feel bad about Republicans. What's really noteworthy about research on social distance is that it turns out that this seems to be an innate response of humans to being in a group. So the French psychologist Henri Tajfel has done some really classic studies where he would take young children and he would say, I'm going to assign you into a group, and the assignment is based on the flip of a coin. So if the coin comes up heads, you're going to stand over there, and if it comes up tails, you're going to go over here. And the next day, he would interview these people, and they had a very strong dislike for the people in the other group, even though it was based on a lottery. So that tells us that there's something about just the idea of being part of a group that generates strong feelings for people in the group and people not in the group. So in the American context, of course, political party affiliation is an especially salient identity. For those of you who are not probably familiar, ask yourself, if you're a Democrat or a Republican, where did that come from? And it turns out it comes from a very early stage of your development. It's parental influence, and there's very good data suggesting that people in kindergarten express party loyalties. They may not understand the full implication of what it means to be a Democrat or a Republican, but nonetheless, it's quite impressive that by the time you're 6 years old in this country, you have acquired a sense of political identification. And of course, it's mainly from your parents. And so in that sense, we would expect the group dynamic, the process I've been describing about in-groups and out-groups, to take root at a very early stage in the development of most Americans' sort of political experience. Okay, so just a quick excursion then into why might we expect fear and loathing in contemporary American politics. One thing we know has changed in this country is in the selection, particularly in the selection of our political leaders, has been the role of the news media. If you looked at American politics in the 1950s or the 1940s, so the famous 1948 presidential campaign between Truman and Dewey, the main sort of spectacle of the campaign was the two candidates crisscrossing the country by train and giving speeches, stump speeches, to groups of citizens just all across the country. Today, of course, it's all based on television, and increasingly through the internet. And the fundamental sort of change was this adoption of primary elections. In the 1960s, we adopted a system of selecting candidates based on direct primaries, and there's a long history, and I could get into this in the question and answer session. The reason we adopted primaries, of course, was to get rid of the influence of the evil party bosses. We wanted to sort of exterminate, stamp out the so-called smoke-filled room. And it was a progressive reform. Progressives said, let's have the voice of the people dictate who gets to run for Congress, for Senate, and of course, for president. And if you're running in a primary election where you need votes, obviously you need to persuade people to vote for you, and the easiest, most convenient platform is television. So by running a commercial on television, you can reach millions of people. It's far more efficient than traveling across the country and going to every single shopping mall in the United States and positioning yourself in front of Walmart and attempting to shake hands with people going in. Obviously, running a TV spot on television is a much more cost-effective way of reaching voters. So the first thing is that American politics has become what we call mediatized. The news media have become critical intermediaries between voters and politicians. And then recently, well, relatively recently, in the 1980s, we had the advent of 24-hour cable television, where you could now tune in to a coverage of politics nonstop. And of course, the last point I want to make is that if you track discourse, what people say over the course of political campaigns, you will very quickly notice that that discourse has shifted quite dramatically into a more shrill and hostile form of speech. And so if you look at this last election between Governor Romney and President Obama, and you just track all the TV ads, and I can tell you we have compiled every single one of those at the Political Communication Lab website. So some 550 TV spots run by these two candidates. Just count them up, view them, and ask the question, did this ad say, vote for me, I'm a good person, or did it say, don't vote for my opponent, he's a bad person? Well, 85% of the ads turn out to be in the latter category. So it's very symptomatic that we are living in an era of negative campaigning, where the dominant form of discourse is to point out the flaws or the deficiencies in your opponent's persona, rather than extolling the virtues of your own credentials. And the explanation for that is quite simple. The explanation is what is news? We don't typically, you don't see the local newspaper doesn't station a correspondent at the local airport to record the safe landing of every plane. It's only planes that crash that become newsworthy. And so if you ask the question, why do candidates typically spend more time going negative, the answer is that's more likely to get into the news. It's much more likely negative but not positive messages are recycled ad infinitum by journalists who, of course, seek conflict and controversy. So one of the reasons, what I'm building up here is the argument that one of the reasons that Democrats and Republicans are becoming more and more sort of feeling more and more animus towards each other is partly a reflection of what's happening in American politics. It's becoming much more mediatized, and there are all these biases that result in the overproduction of negative information. Just to give you a very quick example about this, I mean, it's almost pathological, the demand for negative information on the part of the press. In the 2004 presidential election, you may remember there was a group that ran a TV commercial attacking Senator Kerry. That commercial became quite famous now. It's called the Swift Boat ad, questioning Senator Kerry's war record in Vietnam. That ad ran just one time. It was designed just for press coverage. The point I'm making is that in 2004, in October 2004, if you did a serious analysis of the mainstream press in this country and looked at the amount of news devoted to different subjects, you would reach an astonishing conclusion, namely that swift boats were more newsworthy in October of 2004, were more newsworthy than the war in Iraq, which arguably, I mean, that clearly was the most important event occurring in the world at that time. But this very esoteric piece of campaign rhetoric, the swift boat ad, dominated the war in Iraq as a news item. It tells you the extent to which negativity sells. Okay, so that's just by way of background. Well, this last point, actually, I think you're all familiar with this as well. Cable and talk radio they're venues in which there's a lot of expression of anger. And if you've watched people like any of the hosts on Fox and their counterparts on MSNBC, you know that it's not exactly objective reporting, but it's much more along the lines of partisan commentary. So in that sense, we seem to be moving back into an era of the partisan press, which is what we had, of course, in the 19th century. In this last example of the exchange, Rush Limbaugh describing Miss Sandra Fluck on the issue of whether the healthcare plan ought to cover birth control. This comment, of course, is, I don't want to say it's representative, but it certainly makes the point, the extent to which you get these sort of personal attacks on cable television. Okay, so let me then say a little bit about the evidence that I'm going to present. It's mainly survey data, evidence based on questions that have been asked to representative samples of the American public. The first piece of evidence is the American National Election Studies. ANES refers to this organization which runs a massive survey every 2 years tracking Americans' political positions on a variety of issues. And one of the items in this survey is something called a feeling thermometer, in which the respondent is asked to indicate their positive or negative sentiment for a variety of individuals or groups. And typically, if you the way the metric works on this feeling thermometer, if you really dislike someone or a group, you are asked to place that person on the thermometer at the point of 0. And if you feel extremely warm or favorable, you give that person a score of 100. So theoretically, you could get you could get someone being rated at 10, which would mean you don't like that person at all, and someone at 99, which would mean you're very positive. And we have this thermometer data for the Republican Party and the Democratic Party going all the way back to 1964. So we can look at how people rate the parties on this thermometer now for almost 50 years. And so I'm going to show you some of that data. And what we're going to do there is we're going to break it down we're going to look at how do Democrats rate the Democratic Party and how do Democrats rate the Republican Party, and then flip it and do exactly the opposite. So what I'm going to be showing you are really differences between the in-party and the out-party. And so essentially, if you get a big difference, that's telling you that there's some kind of dislike between the two sides. And I'm also going to be presenting a different set of survey data which have to do more with, I won't talk much about, I won't have time to give you the stereotypes where Democrats are asked about, do Republicans care about the country? Republicans, are they hypocritical? Are they only interested in the wealthy? And conversely, there's a bunch of questions that are asked about the Democrats. I'm going to skip over that. I'm going to focus on the second, a measure of social distance, which is simply sort of a question which asks about the intrusion of politics into interpersonal relations. And the question in particular is one that has to do with how would you feel if your son or daughter, the respondent is asked, it's a hypothetical question, how would you feel if your son or daughter were to marry someone who was a Democrat or a Republican? And that turns out, that question, it turns out, has been asked in both the United States and the United Kingdom. Obviously, in the United Kingdom, it's not Democrat or Republican, but how would you feel if your son or daughter was marrying a Labour Party supporter or a Conservative Party supporter? So we can compare the extent to which the two societies have become sort of more or less distant in that sense. And as you probably have figured by now, it turns out the United States is far more polarized than the United Kingdom. Okay, so as I said just now, I'm going to compute the difference in these thermometer ratings so that we can look at the extent to which the level of animosity has increased. And here's basically what we find. So in the case of these feeling thermometers, over time we get no change in the level of liking for your own party, the in-party, but you get a big drop in the rating of the out-party. which is quite interesting. So if you look at it, here's the data over time. So we've plotted the American National Election Study. So the top two lines are Democrats. The blue line is just Democrats saying, you know, their rating is between 75 and 80 on that thermometer. So they're pretty enthusiastic about their own party. And the Republicans are similarly giving positive ratings, and it's a straight line trend. Nothing has happened since the 1970s. So the in-party is still a positive attitude object. But look at the bottom. You begin to see around the 1980s a steady decline in what Republicans say, how they feel about the Democratic Party, and how Democrats feel about Republicans. In fact, today, as of 2010, you would have to say it's the Democrats who are more negative than the Republicans, at least on the thermometer. But it's not, you know, it's barely by 3 or 4 points. So that's mainly where the polarization has occurred in this. The rating of the out party has become more negative over the last 40 years, quite dramatically so. Just to put this in some perspective, it's dropped by about 15 points on that thermometer rating since 1988. The percentage of the proportion of respondents who give the out party, if you just break it at 50 and say anything less than 50 is negative, you can see that it's now it's almost 2/3 of the country that has a negative image of the party that they don't identify with. And just to put it even, the average out party rating today is 30 on a 100-point scale. Look at the other kinds of out groups in this country. The average rating of Catholics by Protestants is 66. Big business, Democrats rate big business 51, just barely above indifferent. How do Republicans rate gay men and lesbians? Typically, you would think that's an out group, 42. So my point is that the party rating is below all of these other definitions of out groups. It's dominating. There's more animosity across party lines than there is based on religion, based on lifestyle, based on anything you can think of. Even people on welfare, Republicans are giving them, they're putting them right at the middle, 50. So there's something unusual about the partisan distinction. It's attracting much more animosity than other forms of division. So that's exactly what I've just said. It trumps the effects of other cleavages in generating negative sentiment for the outgroup. Okay, so if you look at this, so the only line that's going up here, these are thermometer ratings along party lines, along race. Race, surely one of the most divisive issues in the history of this country is the whole question about race. But if you look at ratings of blacks and whites on the same thermometer, you can see that over time there's no the in-group out-group difference is disappearing. Blacks and whites are increasingly seeing giving them equal ratings. It's a declining pattern for race, the declining pattern for religion, and it's only for party that you see the in-group out-group difference increasing. Okay, so let's move now to this. This is in many ways the more interesting indicator. This is the exact wording of the question, and this question, by the way, was first asked in a classic study. If you're doing comparative politics, you might be familiar with this study, the civic culture, the Alman and Werber study, which was done in the mid-1950s. So this question was first asked very early on, and this is the exact wording. And as you can imagine, in the early days, in the 1950s, when Alman and Werber first asked this question, most Americans actually laughed when they were asked the question. It was a face-to-face interview, and they thought that it was sort of a meaningless question. I mean, why would politics intrude into the question of marriage? It seemed like it was just coming out of left field. But today, as I will show you, it's taken a bit more seriously. The percentage of Americans who now voice some kind of concern or say that they wouldn't be too happy about their son or daughter marrying across party lines is quite high. And it's considerably higher than the exact same question when asked in the United Kingdom, which suggests that there's something about American politics that is generating this sort of animosity. Okay, so this, the top panel is the United Kingdom, and you can see the data from 1960 are on the left, and you can see in the 1960, the percentage of Americans who said they would be displeased at the prospect of their son or daughter marrying across party lines is, for all practical purposes, 0. That's in 1960. If you fast forward to 2008, it's now jumped up to pretty close to a third, and then in 2010, it's increased even further and is approaching something between 35 and 40. So you've got a very steep increase in the United States. Notice that in Britain, there's only a very small parallel increase. So if you plotted those two lines, the difference in the United States would be almost twice what you observe in the UK. So clearly something has happened over the last 50 years to make Americans respond in this fashion. They're more concerned about the prospect of inter-party marriage. Politics, party politics is something that is now relevant for questions of interpersonal relations. And it's not just hypothetical, by the way. We have some very good data now on actual inter-party marriage. So today, marriage across party lines in this country is quite rare. It gets back to this idea that people are living in social environments where there's a lot of political homogeneity. Residential neighborhood patterns are structured by socioeconomic class, and socioeconomic class is a proxy for party politics. And so increasingly the interactions you have are structured along political lines. There's this very important paper by John Alford and his collaborators which shows that this is a really remarkable finding, that spousal selection based on political affinity exceeds the selection based on things like attractiveness. I mean, your stereotype of, why do people pick a spouse? Today, you're going to have to adjust that stereotype. It's not just based on looks. It's not based on personality attributes. It's based on politics. There's very good evidence that spousal selection is now being driven by this whole question of, am I going to get along with this person in a political sense? There's a quote here which I'm going to read to you. This is a remarkable, it is especially revealing that the partisan homogeneity of couples cannot be attributed to de facto agreement based on socioeconomic factors that may be proxies for partisanship, e.g. choices based on education or wealth, or to the gradual persuasive influence of one mate on the other. So you could see where a Republican might marry a Democrat and then gradually convert the Democrat to become a Republican. It's not that. Instead, partisan coupling reflects a process of deliberate spousal selection based on partisan affiliation. I strongly recommend that you take a look at this paper by Alford et al. It's got very compelling evidence on the idea that now marriage has become a question of politics. It's not, it is indeed a case of, a very intimate personal relationship being driven by political considerations. Okay, so there are lots of possible explanations for these trends that I've been describing. The first is that as elites have polarized on the issues, it's possible that because they're advocating very different positions, they appear to be quite different and therefore less likable. The more ideologically apart the candidates, the more easy it is to dislike them. A second possibility is that because of what I alluded to earlier, the rise of media politics and the reliance on negative campaigning, if you sit through a political campaign and all you hear are all these bad things about the Democrat or the Republican, it's quite understandable that voters might come away with a negative impression of politicians. And the last explanation is that increasingly people are now able to select into an information environment where they simply reinforce their biases. So if the Republicans are tuning into Fox and all they're getting is anti-Obama commentary, you can see how this would just reinforce this pattern of polarization. So these are the three hypotheses that I've actually looked at. The first one we have rejected. We've done quite a bit of analysis, and we show that policy preferences are not driving disliking of the other side. It's not the case that people who have more extreme views on abortion or more extreme views on taxing the wealthy, they are not expressing more hostile sentiment for people on the other side of them. There is some correlation, but it's not very substantial. So we are pretty much confident that that's not the story. It's more likely to be the other two. So the second is the idea that over the course of the campaign, because campaigns are so hostile and negative, campaigns essentially teach people to dislike the other side. And if you look at the data here, it's pretty compelling. So we've got data from 2000, the three most recent presidential elections, and on the horizontal axis, we're plotting days to election, and the line, what's being plotted there is just this, the in-party rating, the thermometer ratings I was talking about earlier. So the positive slope is telling you that animosity, the extent to which you give the out party a lower score and the in party a high score, meaning you like them, is increasing over the course of the campaign. Which would seem to suggest that exposure to the campaign has something to do with affective polarization. And this is exactly the same thing with a different measure. We asked people to rate Democrats and Republicans on a variety of traits, and the higher the number, the more likely you are to say bad things about the other side and good things about your own side, and you get exactly the same pattern. So campaigns seem to have quite a bit to do with this increasing animosity across party lines. The last explanation, and the one that I want to spend probably the next 5 minutes before I wrap up, is this idea that in the era of new media, all of you, of course, consume news now on your cell phone, on your laptop or your iPad. You're not sitting in front of a television. You have a lot of choice. You have a lot of control over what you consume. And one of the things you're going to do is filter out information that you would not like to encounter. And clearly one way you filter is by excluding discrepant opinions, excluding dissonant voices. And so that's this notion of selective exposure. And so essentially the argument is that there's a market out there for biased news. You might ask, why is it that Fox is now the #1 cable outlet? Okay, it wins the cable ratings day in and day out. It's not an accident. It's because there is partisan demand for slanted news. Not only is Fox rated #1, MSNBC has recently overtaken CNN. It's not an accident. MSNBC's good fortune in the ratings coincides with their adopting a very deliberate anti-Fox posture. Or they have become the Democratic alternative, the left-leaning cable outlet. So there's clearly money to be made by offering slanted news. And the blogosphere, of course, if you look at the blogosphere, there's just no ifs and buts about it. It's just totally polarized. There are a lot of studies of cross-linking, almost zero evidence of cross-linking. So if you are a participant in the blogosphere, you're just consuming entirely either Republican or Democratic-oriented commentary. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly show you some evidence that people are now increasingly selecting news providers based on their sense of party affiliation. There's a growing literature suggesting that partisans prefer congenial sources, but what's really interesting, it's not just that they prefer partisan sources to follow politics, but it's a much more generic sort of a branding phenomenon. Fox viewers prefer Fox on a variety of subjects, including the latest football scores. So it's become it's literally become a branding. It's exactly what I said. If you're a Republican, the Republican brand for news is going to drive you to consume Fox News on everything, not just on elections and issues. Okay, so here's some experiments we've been running where we give people a bunch of headlines and we observe which headline do they click on. So this is quite a stringent test. It's actual behavior. We're not asking people, do you like this or do you like that? we're running online experiments. This is the grant that we got from Google. And it's all in the context of Google News. And we are giving them the exact same headline, but depending on which condition they're in, it's coming from Fox or from the New York Times. So it's a source manipulation. We're manipulating where the information is coming from. And what we're finding, as you can see here, is the Republicans, it's quite compelling. You can see 60% of the Republicans are clicking on headlines when it is coming from a clearly conservative-oriented source. It could be Fox, it could be Drudge, it could be the Washington Times. There are any number of well-known, labeled Republican sources. And Republicans are doing that almost 2/3 of the time. The Democrats are not as likely to be biased, but close to 40% of the Democrats are clicking on MSNBC or the Huffington Post, well-known Democratic sources. And the independents, as you can see, are pretty much in the middle. This is for hard news. Hard news is news about politics, news about public policy. But notice that when we give them headlines that have to do with celebrities, headlines that have to do with sports, headlines that have nothing to do with substantive public policy, you get almost exactly the same pattern. So once again, you see that it's become ingrained, and it's not just seeking out supportive information in the domain of politics, but across the board. By the way, the fact that this is going on should give you some pause, because it turns out that we are now living in a world where people, depending on your party politics, you have very different beliefs about the state of the world. So in the aftermath of the invasion of Iraq, there's this very famous finding about Fox viewers. A significant proportion of Fox viewers reported that we found weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Okay, I mean, that's, you would have to ask, it's like watching Fox is the functional equivalent of living in a cave. Because, I mean, how could you say that we found weapons of mass destruction when there had been 10 months' worth of news media coverage highlighting precisely the opposite? And you get the same, this idea of the death panels in the Obama healthcare plan. In the interest of equal time, I should tell you that we've just seen some data from this cycle where something like 60% of the people who watch MSNBC claim that Mitt Romney never paid any federal income tax. It's classic, it's just the opposite example of a biased belief that's erroneous, but supportive of your party politics. It's even reached the point where if you ask people, is the economy improving or is the economy sliding back into recession, the answer you get is very much dependent upon you, whether or not you're a Democrat or a Republican. So these beliefs about the world have increasingly become slanted given the information environment that people are carving out for themselves. Okay, the last point I'm going to make is that does this selective exposure, does the fact that we're seeking out information that support our own partisan preferences, how does it affect this question of polarization? Well, these experiments show that the people who select, the Republicans who select Fox, the Democrats who select MSNBC, who exhibit this kind of selective exposure, indeed have more hostile stereotypes of the out party. They have lower thermometer scores, and they also are less likely to approve of intermarriage. So it's suggesting that there is a syndrome here of self-selection into media sources that are providing biased information and a perpetuation of this trend I've been discussing, the trend in the direction of greater disliking, greater animosity for the party that you do not identify with. So, in conclusion, what I'm suggesting is that the most plausible explanation of increased political animus in the society lies in the rhetoric of American political campaigns. And so exposure to negative campaigning is teaching voters to dislike the candidate on the other side. And this new developments in the marketplace for news and the increased freedom of media consumers to seek out information that they find politically congenial. Thank you.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you. So we have about 15 minutes for questions, and I'll come around with a microphone, and I'll ask that when you ask your question, please speak into the mic so that we can record it.
Good afternoon. Is it on?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. This increased polarization trend, how does it bode for the third-party candidates or the growth of the third party or independents? What happens to them?
Well, you would think, understandably, you can imagine if people are increasingly if you're a Democrat and you increasingly dislike Republicans, it's possible that you might be more amenable to something else. But in American politics, we have a slight problem if you're a supporter of a third party. We systematically discriminate against third parties in the way we count votes. And so if you go back to Ross Perot, who got something like 22% of the popular vote, but what did he get by way of representation? He got 0. We do not have proportional representation in this country. Had we, if there were a system of proportional representation, third parties would no doubt flourish, just as they do in Europe, in countries in which generally the rule is, in most European countries, if you get above 10% of the vote, you get a proportional allocation of seats in the national legislature. But we have always, Britain and the United States have always gone for this plurality. I get 2 votes, you get 1. I get everything, you get nothing.
What was the nonpartisan source in the Google study?
Oh, the nonpartisan, the great majority, most mainstream newspapers in this country do not have a party affiliation, even though there are allegations of liberal bias, particularly from the Republicans. So most of our USA Today, for instance, was a nonpartisan source. ABC News, CBS News, any mainstream news organization you can think of, we classified as nonpartisan. The partisan sources are ones that are clearly promoting a particular, so Fox, Drudge, the Washington Times, the Wall Street Journal. Those would be right-leaning sources. The left-leaning sources would include MSNBC, the Huffington Post, a couple of other blogs in particular. But there are very few media outlets that sell themselves as partisan. Down the road, we might see that number increase.
Thank you. I have 2 quick questions. One, your research didn't speak to this, but I wonder if you know. Can you explain, you're showing us the partisanship. Can you tell us why it's so evenly divided? I mean, the most recent election was about 1% of the electorate, difference. That's question 1. And 2, is there anything in your research that helps us understand what many people who look at the Democratic Party, they see a shift to the right over the last 30 years in the Democratic Party, especially on economic
Sure.
issues. And how does that fit in with this whole question of partisanship and that we're more divided than ever if one is actually moving in the direction of the other?
The post-Clinton Democratic Party, the so-called new Democratic Party, was repositioned on social welfare issues. That's well established. But that's a question of ideological polarization. That's where the idea there is that the Democratic Party is shifting to the right on things like social welfare, on how much should we be spending on social welfare programs. I'm not disputing that. I'm proposing an alternative definition of polarization, which is based exclusively on affect. But the earlier question about the 1%, when in fact these numbers are showing more and more increased animus, why is it not a closer reflection? There are more Democrats than Republicans. Why is it that Obama only won? Actually, he ended up winning by between 3 and 4%. I'm excluding independents. Okay, so the people who don't have a party affiliation, that's between 25 and 30% of the population. And by the way, you have to be very you have to take that with a grain of salt. About 28% of Americans say they are independent, quote unquote. They are neither Democrat nor Republican, and so they don't have. So for them, there is no concept of in-group or out-group, as I have laid out here. The caveat I would toss into the mix is that quite a few of these independents are closet partisans. And indeed, when you look at their voting behavior, they're just pulling the straight party ticket all the way down. But they say they're independent. It's hard to get a good estimate on what's the exact number of true independents. My guess is it's got to be about 10%. So the bottom line is most Americans are partisan, and what I've tried to show is that that sense of partisan identity is increasingly producing a deep sense of suspicion and distrust of people who are on the other side, and that's essentially sort of the bottom line. Eric.
Do you agree that those that identify themselves as independent are more realistically the opposite for red or blue, rather than red or blue being more of their opponents?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part. Are they?
Do you believe that those that claim to be independent would more realistically be the opponents rather than red and blue being opponents for each other?
No, I think the people identifying as independents are somehow on the sidelines. They're not sort of swept up in this the negativity of campaigning. So the Republicans are relishing every time Romney runs an ad saying Obama is the welfare president. The Republicans are applauding, and the Democrats are saying it's disgusting. And when Obama says, oh, look, Bain Capital, they're just sending all these jobs overseas. Here's this poor woman who lost her health insurance and she died. The Republicans are saying, can you believe this kind of nonsense? And the Democrats are saying, well, what a bad guy Romney is. And the independents are just scratching their heads. The book that we wrote on going negative shows that independents are so turned off by the negative tactics that they become less likely to vote. And one of the consequences of negative campaigning in this country is that increasingly it's Democrats and Republicans who show up at the polls. The independents are being demobilized because they really find these tactics off-putting.
Okay, I guess I've got two questions. The first one, it's very clear from what you've talked about that you see a tremendous amount of very solid party identification, to put it lightly. There was a lot of discussion about the efficacy of different polling techniques and different sampling. And a number of pollsters were saying that they felt like affiliations were fairly fluid. So are there implications for what you're finding for the way in which polling should be done going forward?
It's a very good question, and it's a fascinating question, and one that I've actually spent a lot of time thinking about. First of all, let me point out this. This is just established for the last 4 presidential elections in a row. 95% of people who say they have a party identification vote for the presidential candidate of their party. Okay? That's telling us that there's almost no deviation. Now, the second point is the most fascinating question concerning the 2012 election. There was all this debate about the skewing of partisanship in the polls. The Republicans in particular were arguing, look, you've got more Democrats in these surveys than Republicans. That's why Obama's winning by 4 or 5 percentage points. It's not matching up what you should get from the exit poll, which is the poll taken of people who actually vote. It turns out my Stanford colleague Doug Rivers runs a polling company, and he's been doing some really interesting work. It turns out it's actually a symptom of precisely what I've been talking about. After the Republican convention and Clint Eastwood and the empty chair, when I call you and you're a Republican, you've just watched the Republican convention, I call you up and say, oh, this is the Gallup poll, we want to talk to you about politics. You say, forget it, I'm not interested. It turns out that when there are depressing, quote, events, like the first debate for the Democrats don't respond. They don't want to talk politics. They're depressed. And so the Republicans, it's a selection bias. They select into the polls, and there are more Republicans. And that's why you got this big bump for Romney after the first debate. But in reality, nothing really changed. It was simply an artifact of partisans saying, man, I'm in a funk. I don't want to talk to you about my political opinions. That's exactly what happened. It's a fascinating story about the incentives underlying why people participate in a political poll. When things are going well, you're happy to answer questions. When things are not going so well, you say, forget it. I'm not interested in politics.
That's fascinating. The other question I had was, you mentioned that 85% of the television ads that you have archived were negative. Is that consistent over the last number of cycles, or is that something unique to this one and unique to the particular strategies of this campaign?
No, it's explosively, it typically runs about 50 to 60% negative. This election is off the scale, and one of the reasons is, of course, the huge infusion of super PAC money. So the 85% number includes Crossroads, GPS, Karl Rove's groups, the Democratic groups, where, of course, they don't have to, there's no accountability. You know, there's no one who shows up at the end and says, I'm Barack Obama and I approved this message. So they can say whatever they want, and of course they have a much more, they're much nastier. The tone of those ads are especially negative.
I'm glad to be here. I'm sorry. I'm over here.
Oh, okay.
I'm glad to be here, and first question, I think I know the answer, but you don't have a dog in this fight, I take it. You're neutral.
Which question?
The first question is, you don't have a dog in this fight. You're neutral. You're just pointing out what you're finding.
I'm not.
Okay.
I vote. I typically vote more Democratic than Republican, but that doesn't influence my research. No.
Okay. The next one is, if we did have a news source that was truly ethical, if you will, and didn't slant the news, would we grow into that, and would they survive? Would there be an audience for that?
No, this is, again, I was talking to Eric about this on the way in. The reason we have negative campaigning, and the reason we have Fox News, and the reason we have talk radio is because there is a market for those kinds of sources. So I take it in a sense you're asking the question, how do we scale back on all of this and return to the good old days of Walter Cronkite and the CBS News and 100 million people watching the three networks? Well, you're going to have to change popular culture. You're going to have to change consumer demand. It's going to have to be bottom up. It can't be legislated. It can't be regulated. It has to be. Imagine a scenario when a candidate says, my opponent is a sleazebag, and everyone says, I'm going to vote for him. Then and only then will we see a return to the days of positive campaign. But it's possible that day might come.
Back when we were all sleazebags?
Well, the point is, if the public sends a message saying, anytime you run a negative ad, that's one strike against you, then you might see some change in the behavior.
So, is this? We
That's
have
the
new
last
fancy
question,
mics.
Brian.
I can't tell how to turn them on. So I guess I have two questions too, since that's the new pattern we're doing.
Sure.
So first question is, so let's say theoretically we return to sort of a late 19th century model where every newspaper has a bias, and like voter turnout was 80-some-odd% back then.
Yeah, exactly.
So my first question is that a bad thing, necessarily? And then my second question is, I know you sometimes work with Don Kinder, and so he likes to explain American politics in terms of resentment towards outgroups, and especially sort of racial resentment. And he thinks that's been this incredible motivating and organizing force in American politics. And in one way, racial resentment is this one of the things that he studies is this thing people feel, it influences their opinions. It's not something they're comfortable talking about, yelling about, telling pollsters about, whereas it's really easy to tell a pollster how much you hate Republicans, or it would appear especially easy for Republicans to tell pollsters how much they hate Democrats and don't want their kids to marry them. So I'm curious if you think
That's a very
it's sort of like other versions of resentment are now getting folded into partisan resentment where they're easier to talk about in some way.
That's a very interesting question. And yes, I mean, so Don Kinder and David Sears, these two political scientists who came up with this variable called racial resentment, because you can't ask old-fashioned racism in a survey context. Every American now has figured out what's the right answer to the question. If you say, rate the following groups, and one of the ratings is intelligent. And African Americans, do you think they're intelligent? And you say, you know, it goes from 1 to 7 or whatever. Everyone has figured out that the normatively appropriate answer to that question is to say they are just as intelligent as anyone else. So you can't measure racism using that kind of logic. So Don Kinder and his colleague David Sears came up with a more subtle way, and they phrased these survey questions more in terms of people who would rather be on welfare than work. People who wanted special benefits from the government in the form of things like affirmative action. So they thought it was a more indirect way of getting at the basic sense of prejudice against this outgroup. And indeed, their findings suggest that there is more than meets the eye. I mean, if you looked at, you know, are you willing to vote for an African American for president? Everyone says yes. So you might conclude we are in a post-racial society. Kinder and Sears would suggest quite the contrary, that this level of resentment is still quite high. So your point is that it's politically convenient to say nice things about outgroups when they're defined on the basis of race, when they're defined on the basis of religion, but it's perfectly acceptable to say that Democrats are scumbags. No one feels any compunction to say, oh, I better be politically correct and say these are good people. That's a good point. The way we have addressed that is we have developed, the psychologists have done a lot of measurement research into what we call implicit attitudes. I strongly recommend, if you haven't already done so, go to the Project Implicit website at Harvard and take the race implicit association test. It's all based on reaction time. You can't control your response. And about 80% of the people who take that test come away with a prejudiced response towards non-whites. So at the implicit level, we are all prejudiced. Well, we have developed exactly the same protocol. We have an implicit test of partisan bias. We give people the elephant and the donkey, red, blue, and various iconic images of the two parties, and we subject them to the exact same reaction test. And it's really quite startling. The level of implicit bias against the out party exceeds the level of racial implicit bias by a substantial margin. So even at the subconscious level, when these arguments about political correctness are out the window because you can't possibly be controlling it, we are getting a huge, huge differential in favor of the outgroup defined by party. And I'll just give you a last example. In these experiments, we've been asking people, we give them a judgment task which is totally non-political. So we give them 2 resumes of high school seniors, and the resumes are identical except in one respect. With the extracurricular activity, the person was either the president of Young Republicans or Young Democrats. And the task of the respondent is to decide which of these 2 high school students ought to be nominated for a scholarship. And of course, we get exactly what you'd expect. All the Republicans say no. Well, not all, but 60% say no when the guy was president of Young Democrats. And about 55% of the Democrats vote against when. So here is a totally non-political judgment, but party politics has become a litmus test for evaluating candidates for scholarships. So I would submit the evidence is quite compelling that it's not simply a impression management that people are saying, I'll bash the parties, but I won't bash other outgroups. So I don't think it's an artifact of that logic, although I think that's a perfectly plausible and reasonable supposition. And so I'm glad you asked that. It's clearly an alternative hypothesis.
So those are all the questions we have time for today. So I'd like to thank you all for coming and join me in thanking.